So we have major new developments in the Benson case where the DC Court of Appeals struck down the district's ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. That ruling was already a huge deal, but now the legal battle over that ruling has escalated very fast. DC is currently trying to freeze the impact of that ruling, and they have now filed a petition for rehearing en banc, filed a motion to expedite that hearing, and asked the court to suspend the precedential effect of that ruling. But now the plaintiffs have fired back. They have filed a direct opposition to that request, and their response is extremely important for what happens next in this case. So in this video, we're going to break down what DC is trying to do procedurally, how the plaintiffs have responded, and why this actually may strengthen the impact of the Benson ruling going forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to give you as much as possible as a member. They're always expanding their coverage to civil liability coverage, red flag laws, 4 guaranteed attorneys for your self-defense case, and they're always adding so much more. So if you're interested, you can check them out using the links down below. And if you decide to sign up and you use my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $25 off of your sign-up fee. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about the Benson case and that ruling there, which struck down DC's ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Now, first, quickly, let's recap what happened in Benson, which is critical for understanding what is going on currently in this case. So as you may recall, the DC Court of Appeals ruled that the district's ban on magazines does in fact violate the Second Amendment. Not only did the court strike down the magazine ban itself, but it also vacated several of Benson's related firearms convictions. Those included the possession of an unregistered firearm, the unlawful possession of ammunition, and carrying a pistol without a license. The court there said that those convictions were infected by the unconstitutional magazine ban and therefore could not stand. That was a sweeping ruling with potentially massive implications, and now DC is trying to contain the fallout of that ruling. In response, the district decided to move very quickly, and they filed an emergency motion asking for the court to suspend the precedential status of the opinion. So in simple terms, they want the ruling to exist but not be binding law while this case is moving forward for a rehearing and while they're trying to currently overturn it. At the same time, they are now officially filing for a petition for a rehearing en banc, and they asked the court to expedite review of that petition. So they're trying to fast track this case and contain the impact of that ruling immediately. Now, here's the key update for what is now happening in this case. The plaintiffs have filed a formal opposition to this motion that was filed by DC, and their argument is very direct. They state that what DC is asking for is not just wrong procedurally, it is also improper and basically unprecedented. First, the plaintiffs argue there is no legal authority allowing a court to suspend the precedential effect of its own opinion. They point out that once a published decision is issued, it is binding law unless and until it is vacated. So not a pause, not tried to weaken it, but not even put on hold, but vacated. That is the remedy that you need. And under the court's own rules, that only happens if a rehearing en banc is granted or the decision is eventually overturned. So they argue DC is trying to invent a brand new procedural tool that doesn't exist under the court's rules. Second, the plaintiffs say that everything DC is arguing right now are just arguments for rehearing, not arguments for suspending the precedent. In other words, if DC thinks that this case was wrongfully decided, then the proper process is very simple. File for a petition for a rehearing en banc and try to win in front of the en banc panel. But you don't get to strip the decision of its legal effect before the court even decides whether they want to rehear this en banc. Now, one of DC's biggest claims was that this ruling is creating chaos. So the District of Columbia was claiming that this would create confusion for law enforcement officers, that there would be chaos because there were going to be conflicting legal standards based on what the DC Circuit said and what the DC Court of Appeals said. But the plaintiffs pushed back against that very hard. They argue that this is an easy solution that can be resolved actually by DC itself. If the law is unconstitutional, then the district should simply just stop enforcing it and there would be no confusion. They even point out that the federal government had already stopped enforcing the ban in this specific context. So any chaos is not coming from the ruling itself. It's coming from DC trying to continue to enforce a law that has already been struck down and found unconstitutional. DC also argued that this Benson ruling conflicts with other cases and other precedent, but the plaintiffs say that argument is also overstated. For example, they explained that the federal DC Circuit ruling that the district here tries to rely on did not actually decide the merits of the Second Amendment issue. It was a preliminary injunction ruling. So Benson was the first full merits ruling on this issue, and it was the first one in this jurisdiction, and therefore it should be treated differently from what happened in a prior case. So here's where things currently stand now with this issue. We have a binding appellate decision striking down a magazine ban in DC. A petition for rehearing en banc has now been filed. A motion for an expedited rehearing and review of that petition has also been filed, and a pending request to strip the opinion of its precedential effect. So the en banc panel now has to decide three things. First, whether to grant that suspension request by DC. Second, whether to take the case en banc. And third, how quickly they're going to move on this issue. So here's the key takeaway of what's going on. This aggressive response from DC actually shows just how impactful this ruling actually is. Because if this ruling wasn't a big deal, you wouldn't see DC trying to file emergency motions, expedited rehearings for en banc review, and attempts to strip the precedential value and impact of this ruling. The fact that all of this is happening really quick tells you that this ruling is already shaping the national legal landscape surrounding, the Second Amendment, and also, how this needs to be interpreted when it comes to magazines. Also remember that this isn't happening in isolation. This ruling is already being cited and presented to other courts. You have the Duncan versus Bonta case, which is currently in front of the Supreme Court. You have the Cheeseman and A&G RPC case in front of the Third Circuit en banc panel, and then also the PICA challenges out of the Seventh Circuit. And so this case, Benson, is being presented to all of those courts as a reason for why they should also strike down magazine bans in those jurisdictions. So here's where we currently stand. The Benson decision is still binding law right now. DC is trying to freeze it and overturn it, and the plaintiffs are fighting to keep it in place and also trying to oppose a rehearing en banc. And now the court is potentially going to move quickly with potentially a rehearing en banc. They're going to consider that en banc petition. And, they also have to decide if they're going to take an expedited review of this issue and also suspend the ruling's impact while they rehear this case. That is all very critical for not only what happens in this Benson case going forward, but also, what happens in all these other cases where Benson is being cited. So that's the latest update in this Benson magazine ban case. The fight is now shifting from the merits to the high stakes procedural battle over whether this ruling stays in effect. So as soon as we get more information as the court decides what they want to do on this issue, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of two-way content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.